Coming up on Chasing the Natty, it's officially playoff season for the 2024 CFF season. There is no more room for error, so all the more reason for you guys to check out what we have to say on this week's waiver wire. We'll talk about some of the big Week 11 performers that you should be avoiding on the waiver wire, and then we'll get to the most important part. We'll be covering the players that you should be adding to your roster that'll be crucial as you take on your playoff runs in the next upcoming weeks. We've got all of that and more coming right after this.
Look at GT go, breaks the tackle, he's 10, he's touchdown! Cook's gonna throw the deep ball, and Burton caught the defense! Touchdown, Luther Burton! Milrow gonna run it again, got a lane, kicked in the turbo, Milrow! Goodbye, touchdown, Bama!
This is Chasing the Natty, a college fantasy football podcast. All right, welcome in everyone. This is Jared Palmgren, host of the Chasing the Natty podcast. I hope you guys are having a wonderful ride to your work on this Monday morning. We are the College Fantasy Football Podcast on the Campus to Canton Podcast Network. You can find us on all of your podcast feeds and on YouTube every Monday and Wednesday morning during the season at 6 a.m. sharp. If you want to support the great work we are doing here, head on over to campuscanton.com. Subscribe there to any of our phenomenal tiers. We have content ranging on all sorts of college football games, whether it's CFF, Devy, C2C, College IDP, College DFS. Really, if you play it, then we've got content, whether that's tools, rankings, pretty much everything you need to succeed. If you want to get in touch for whatever reason, you can find me and the show on Twitter. I'm at CFF_Jared, and the show is at Chasing the Natty. And if y'all have not already, make sure you show us some love by leaving a like, a comment, and a subscribe. If you're on the YouTube side of things, if you're on the podcast side of things, make sure you take some time to leave a 5-star review and make sure you are following the show. Not only do all of those things help us and show your support, but you're also supporting the game of college fantasy football in general by helping us get in front of the eyeballs of people who might be interested in this kind of stuff. So, all that being said, y'all, we're not at the finish line yet, obviously. That's championship week and everything like that. But it really just, every time we get into playoff season for CFF, it just feels like we're opening a brand new chapter. It's almost like the season restarts at this point, right? There's no more room for error. Like I said in the intro of the show, one bad week and you're done, right? Like, now granted, I know a lot of you are in leagues where, it's a 14 playoff, so therefore you technically have one more week. But even still, right? Like, even if you have 4 teams, you're probably still in a matchup of some kind that is going to determine whether or not you're making the playoffs or not. Now, I know a lot of you who listen to this show dominate your leagues, and so you probably could afford to lose this week, so maybe you are taking the week off. I personally, even if I know that I am locked into a playoff spot, I'm still fighting every single week, because you never know what kind of crazy things happen, right? You don't want to get distracted. You don't want to lose your edge or anything like that. You got to make sure you're paying attention still to all these things, especially the waiver wire, which is exactly what we will be discussing today. As always, you guys know the drill at this point. We're going to be focusing on the waiver wire traps and the waiver wire pickups for this week. Unfortunately, I just did not have time to put together some of the freakout lists for this week. So appreciate all of our friends over at the NIL tier at Campus Canton Discord, but I'll present some of my thoughts to you guys for the couple players that you guys brought up to me. But for today's show, we are going to actually skip over that for today, and we'll hop right into the waiver wire traps, which I think we can just go ahead and do right now. So again, a lot of you guys know the drill by now. You guys know the kind of things that I look for, and probably one player on this list is going to really surprise people. Otherwise, you guys pretty much know the drill. I guess we'll go ahead and start with the easy ones, like Skylar Locklear, quarterback at UTEP. Great performance this past week, right? That offense goes to overtime, puts up 43 points on Kennesaw State. Locklear finishes the day with just over 32 fantasy points, over 300 yards, 4 touchdowns. But again, if you go and look at the rest of his games, it's very clear that this was very much a benefit of facing Kennesaw State. Kennesaw State is a team that is, quite frankly, broken. There's a reason why the head coach was fired earlier today. And I know some of my friends disagree on that firing, and to a point I agree that probably should give him 2 years in the FBS before you really decide what you're going to do there. But at the same time, right, like Kennesaw State was like, yes, he got them to the playoffs in the FCS level a few times, but they haven't really they've been on a downhill trend pretty much the last couple of years. So I also don't blame Kennesaw State for moving on. Regardless, again, this just goes back to Locklear's performance, right? Like he's facing a Kennesaw State defense, or that is, clearly I think that team kind of knew that the head coach was on the outs. They haven't really, especially the defense is struggling quite a bit right now. The offense has looked actually a lot better last couple of weeks, so good on them for that. But I'm not trusting Locklear. Don't grab him, pick him up. I don't care what kind of matchups he has in the next couple of weeks here. It's just not worth it. I think he's actually off this week, and then he has 2 more matchups to finish the season. And then I'll just run through the 3 wide receivers here real quick. Cam Vaughn, wide receiver of Jacksonville State. Great performance this past week. 11 targets, 7 catches, 130 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And that's not his only good performance, right? Like, again, against Kennesaw State back in early October, 7 targets, 7 catches, 96 yards. 2 weeks before that, against Eastern Michigan, 9 targets, 6 catches, 94 yards, and a touchdown. So it's not to say that Vaughn is like, just a complete one-hit wonder or anything like that, but it's also very clear that he's not one of those guys that's fully involved in the game plan every single week, right? Because, again, just last week against Liberty, 2 targets, 1 catch, 39 yards. Against Middle Tennessee State, 4 catches, 82 yards, but only 4 targets, right? 3 targets versus New Mexico State. Like, it's very up and down his usage. Not somebody you want to rely on going forward. There's just better options out there. Julian Gray, man, I got excited when I got the score notifications this past weekend of Gray scoring multiple touchdowns. I'm sitting here thinking like, oh man, maybe we got ourselves our top Liberty wide receiver again. The same guy we've been trying to chase pretty much since the preseason, like who's that CJ Daniels replacement? Maybe we get a guy emerging late here. Nope. Julian Gray is basically pulling a Michael Matheson here, where he had 1 target, 1 catch, 34 yards for a touchdown, and then he had 3 carries for 52 yards and a touchdown, right? That's 4 opportunities, 2 touchdowns, multiple breakaway plays here. That really, if you look at the rest of his games, just aren't there for him consistently. Like, it'd be one thing if he was a guy that just broke off long plays all the time. Like, we've seen players do that before, but in this case, absolutely not. And then Justin Bowick, wide receiver out of Ball State. He is kind of a latecomer for Ball State. Again, he was injured to, I believe, the start of the year, and now he's kind of slowly coming back. 5 targets versus Vanderbilt, 7 targets versus NIU, 11 targets versus Miami of Ohio. So there is a path here for him to potentially, continue to do this, but it's also Ball State. They're not that much far ahead of Kent State in terms of just like they're getting beaten pretty badly a lot of times. At the very least, Ball State's trying, so I'll give them that. But the scoring opportunities are just not there for them. Obviously, Bowick did great this past week, 171 yards and a touchdown. But before that, he had 2 30-yard performances in a row. I'm just not ready to quite buy into the idea that Bowick is a consistent starter, not during the playoffs at least, right? Like, at this point, we got to be a bit more fickle with some of the guys we're picking up on. I say as some of the waiver wire players we will talk about today definitely have some risk to them. So those are the 3 wide receivers. I'll finish up with Kyle Robichaux here, the running back out of Boston College. And this is going to sound very hypocritical later, because I have a running back that it has not done anything to this point, but then had himself a monster game last week that I am willing to pick up on waiver wires. Meanwhile, Kyle Robichaux here, man, not that he's had bad performances, right? But, he's had 10 or less carries in each of the 3 games before this point. And then this past week against Syracuse, clearly Boston College figured something out there, because he had 28 carries for 198 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now, fingers crossed, maybe they do continue with this moving forward, but also it's a bit of a red flag when a guy goes from 9, 10, 4 carries to 28. and is suddenly averaging over 7 yards a carry when he couldn't really do that at any other point during this season, right? Very much screams one-hit wonder for me here. I don't love the fact that, again, Jordan McDonald is getting a ton of run here as well. Maybe things fully changed at Boston College with them benching Thomas Castellanos this past game. Maybe they do just go on with the full rushing attack here, but I honestly don't think that this is something I feel like we can rely on moving forward. So I am saying hold off on Kai Robichaux. I'm not trusting that 28 carries to be consistent moving forward. So with that being said, that is it for our waiver wire traps. Again, kind of ran through those relatively quickly, but we need to get to the players that are actually going to help you guys out here. I'll start with quarterbacks, and honestly, no, I'll go through the main quarterbacks. I was thinking about doing my honorable mentions first because this is a scenario where I think, like in several past weeks, right, where I can recommend you guys like Fernando Mendoza here. We will talk about we'll talk about him, and then also again we'll talk about Ethan Vasco and Cole Snyder. All three quarterbacks I think are worth taking a look at in CFF leagues. But if you really want some more consistent options, stay tuned for the honorable mentions at the very end. Some guys I've talked about in previous weeks that I think are better than the guys I'll go in depth on here. But for now, we can start with Fernando Mendoza. And Mendoza's kind of been on a bit of a roller coaster. Had some really good games to kind of start the season here. Things did start looking a little rough for him and the Bears during their 2-game stretch against Pitt and NC State. Some very low-scoring games there. Both of those games, Mendoza barely cleared 10 fantasy points here. However, Cal's schedule is set to improve quite a bit here, especially in these next 2 weeks, right? Or especially in the last 2 weeks, not these next 2 weeks. Mendoza has been the prime beneficiary over the last couple of weeks. Against Oregon State and Wake Forest, the Bears were able to put up 2 40-plus point performances on offense. In each of those games, Mendoza cracked 350-plus passing yards and 2+ touchdowns. Obviously, I'd love to see the touchdown numbers kind of come up here a little bit, but again, having 350 passing yards is a very, very good baseline to just kind of have each week. And you might be wondering, like, well, what if Cal's schedule kind of regresses back to some harder matchups in these last 3 weeks? Well, on that front, I have some good news and I have some bad news, right? I'll start with the bad news. I always start with bad news first because then you end on a positive note. Bad news is Mendoza faces SMU during championship week, and according to our numbers from C2C Winning Edge, the Mustangs are ranked 8th in team defensive performance, which is obviously not a great matchup. Very much could be reminiscent of Cal's performances against NC State and Pitt. But the good news is that Mendoza has himself some incredible matchups here in the next 2 weeks, right? You got Syracuse and Stanford. Both Syracuse and Stanford ranked 80+ in team defensive performance. Stanford in particular is just in the dumpster on defense. They're ranking 120th versus the pass. Mendoza and this offense should be able to continue their streak of good offensive performances against these teams. I think that it makes Mendoza an excellent addition for teams with bye weeks either this week or if you have like Dylan Gabriel in week 13. I think Mendoza could easily be somebody you pick him up now so you can plan for next week and you just have that secondary option to plug in during that matchup. Next up here, let's look at Ethan Vasco, the quarterback out of Coastal Carolina, rostered on 25% of rosters. This past week, he went 14 for 18 for 150 yards and a touchdown. He also had 13 attempts on the ground for 52 yards and a touchdown there. So, how do I want to start this? I fully admit that Vasco has not quite lived up to what I wanted him to, right? I had him as a waiver wire ad earlier this year. I was ready for him to kind of continue that great run that he was on to finish last year, but it's kind of suffice to say, between injuries, overall offensive ineffectiveness, that has not materialized. And even over the last couple of weeks, right, Vasco hasn't still hit that ceiling for CFF that I really want him to. He had 20 points versus Troy, 21 points this past week against Appalachian State. But I am willing to put Vasco out here as an ad for teams going into their playoff runs, right? Coastal Carolina, they just fired their offensive coordinator, Travis Trickett, and due to that previously mentioned offensive ineffectiveness. And since then, this Coastal offense is looking, in my opinion, much better, right? Much of that has to do with better usage of Braden Bennett. Yes, he's over 30% rostered, but if he is available in your league, you should absolutely go add Braden Bennett. He's going to be a must-add for playoff runs here. But in addition to Bennett just being used better, a lot of it's also better execution on Vasco's part. I like what they're doing with the offense to kind of make Vasco a lot more comfortable here. And in this past week in particular, you could really see it start to benefit Vasco, right? He was throwing for 8.3 yards per attempt, one of the best he's had this season. And then he also completed 78% of his passes, right? He's also scored on the ground once in each of the last 2 games. They're using his legs a lot better around the goal line. So I am definitely liking where this is going for Vasco. But what really sells Vasco is his playoff schedule, right? His next 3 games are against Marshall, Georgia Southern, and Georgia State. Good Lord, the Sun Belt is very blessed for giving us these matchups, right? Vasco will be in a dreamland regarding his legs. Each of these 3 teams that I just mentioned, Marshall, Georgia Southern, Georgia State, they're all 111th or worse in team defensive performance against the run. Meanwhile, Marshall secondary can kind of put up a fight, but both Georgia Southern and Georgia State secondaries can be carved up like a nice block of cheese, right? Vasco should absolutely be able to have some of his best performances here towards the end of the season. It's what he was able to do last year. I'm really hoping we see Vasco hit another level here, especially if he's able to perform well against Marshall. Sky could be the limit for him in the last couple of weeks. I think he is a great ad for somebody looking to plug in to account for maybe some unfavorable matchups over the next couple of weeks. So I like Vasco. Let's move on to our third and final quarterback ad of the week, and that is Mr. Cole Snyder, the quarterback out of Eastern Michigan, rostered on 9% of leagues. He, this past week, went 24 for 45 for 265 yards and 2 touchdowns. He also had 12 rushing attempts for 65 yards. No touchdowns, but he definitely can get those touchdowns as well. As I kind of mentioned, again, a lot of the new quarterback options just aren't really there on the waiver wire this week. There's a lot of other guys from previous weeks that are there, but I'm willing to take a shot on Cole Snyder for a couple of reasons, right? Over the last several weeks, Snyder's very much shown that he can be a solid, steady play, especially as the season kind of draws to a close here. His last 3 games were against Toledo, Akron, and Central Michigan. They've really shown that he can kind of produce no matter what level of MAC defense is kind of thrown against him, right? Like, obviously, Central Michigan and Akron are a little bit laughable defenses, but Toledo's no joke, and Cole Snyder was still able to put up the stat line I just read you, right? The 265, 2 touchdowns, finished the day with 25.1 fantasy points. Like, Snyder's able to produce really no matter what happens with Eastern Michigan, unless they just completely fall apart over the next couple of weeks. He's also got himself some really quietly high passing volume. He's had 40-plus passing attempts at each of his last 2 games. Before that, he almost hit 40 against Central Michigan. I think he had 38 passing attempts in that game. This has pretty much allowed him to throw for 300 yards in 2 of his last 3 games. And then on top of that, I kind of mentioned his legs earlier with his 65 yards against Toledo. He also had 48 against Central Michigan. From all these stats I'm kind of throwing at you, you can see that while Snyder isn't really shown to be consistent in any of these one areas or another, like I said, like he's had good rushing stats 2 of the last 3 games, 300 plus in 2 of his last 3 games. Like, he's always missing something, it feels like, each week. But one thing does kind of remain consistent. He won't be a bust for you on your fantasy teams. He's going to find a way to earn those fantasy points, right? Over the last 3 weeks, 34.8 versus Central Michigan, 23.66 versus Akron, 25.1 versus Toledo. So what does this all mean? Like what kind of upcoming schedule does he have, Jared? Well, like many Maction players, Snyder's end-of-year schedule is very appetizing. He gets to face the likes of Ohio, Buffalo, and Western Michigan. While Ohio might be kind of a semi-tough matchup among those 3, I don't think one shouldn't expect, and I do think one shouldn't expect too much, but Eastern Michigan's offense definitely won't wither away before them, and we've seen some teams put up some points on Ohio. Like, yeah, they're definitely the toughest defensive matchup among the three left here for the Eagles, but there's still no indication that they're going to really be able to shut down Eastern Michigan's offense here. Meanwhile, Buffalo and Western Michigan both rank outside the top 100 in defensive team performance against the pass. Both of them are outside the top 80 in that same metric against the run. I think that Eastern Michigan has the chance to have two of its best offensive performances in the final weeks, and Snyder is going to be a huge part of that. So I think he absolutely is somebody you can pick up for as a potential guy to stave off some rough matchups there in Week 13 and Week 14. So, with all that being said, let's take a look at some of these honorable mentions. Again, these are guys I've mostly talked about already. Colton Joseph's been fantastic. He gets to go up against James Madison this week, though, so I don't love that matchup. But as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, that Joseph's usage and skill set makes it to where he should be still pretty all right, even against a tough defensive matchup. So I like him this week. Oh, McCowan might be in the CFF matchup of the week there with UTSA facing North Texas. I haven't seen what the over-under is for this game yet, but man, I think it's probably dang close to guaranteeing that it'll be above 70 between these two. There's going to be so many points scored. Caden Hauser, I'm shocked that he's still as low rostership as he is. I think it's at 11% right now. Might have gone up to 12. Regardless, like, he's been on fire the last couple of weeks. 30 points versus Army, 30 points versus Temple, 44 points versus Florida Atlantic. And you might be scoffing at the schedule, but like, just ask Chandler Morris how difficult it is to put up some points against Army, right? Like, Hauser has just been on fire recently. 2 straight games of 5+ touchdowns. He could go nuts again against Tulsa this week. Caden Anderson, quarterback out of Wyoming. I mentioned him on last week's show. He gets Colorado State this week. I'm still a little queasy about that. I definitely wouldn't start him probably yet, but grabbing him off the waiver wire, plugging him in, and potentially having him there for week 13 and 14 could be fantastic if he does well against Colorado State. And then last but not least, Spencer Petras. Again, not the best game against Washington State here, but regardless, he gets Hawaii this week. I think he's a pretty safe floor option. And with all that being said, I think I can take a sip of water, and then we can move on to our running backs for this week. All right, moving on to our running backs here. Also, I probably should mention at the top of the show, for each of the positions, I'm only going with 3 players this week, because again, we're pretty late in the season. We're not looking to overhaul our rosters every single week here. There's just not as many players on the waiver wire as well. But for the most part, if you're going into the playoffs, you've got yourself a really solid team, and you mostly have the guys you want already. So I'm not going to throw out a bunch of names out here that are going to potentially confuse you. One guy that you would not be confused about, though, is Amani Marshall, the running back out of Appalachian State, rostered on 2% of leagues this past week. 28 rushing attempts, 124 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Unfortunately, Marshall is on bye this week. Then he gets James Madison, another tough matchup, but he finishes the season against Georgia Southern. So potentially we are looking at a guy that you can grab now and stash until championship week. I don't know how appetizing that sounds to any of y'all, but even still, I have to admit that I'm a bit ashamed that it's taken me so long to talk about Marshall, though. Why, you might ask? Because I don't know how I completely missed that for the last 4 weeks, a Appalachian State running back has hit 18+ touches and 100+ yards in each of his games, and I'm only just now noticing. Like, this feels criminal to me. Regardless, better late than never. Let's talk a little bit more about Amani Marshall here. Part of what made me not think about Appalachian State really at all over the last several weeks is that, again, it's just been such a mosh pit at the running back position, right? We thought, somebody like Kanye Roberts might be able to break away, but he's kind of faded greatly in the second half of the season. Quite frankly, I wouldn't be surprised to see him portal after the season, but a huge reason for this, or for Roberts' kind of regression this second half of the season here, is the emergence of Marshall, right? He's been phenomenal for the Mountaineers, pretty much consistently finding somewhere between 115 and 125 yards on the ground pretty much every single game that he has been the workhorse back. Granted, a couple of these opponents he's faced, like Old Dominion and Georgia State, like those are just not good rushing defenses. But the great news on that front is that he still has some solid matchups to finish the season here, even if they're not, fantastic, right? He's getting some incredible volume here, which might still be able to carry him, like I said, even against the likes of James Madison, right? But then again, the golden piece is that Week 14 matchup against Georgia Southern. If Marshall can get 20 plus, opportunities against the like of Georgia Southern's rushing defense, which currently ranks 119th in the country defending the run, Marshall could be an epic stash for you to grab and hide away for championship week, play him at the last moment and go for it. Another running back that's kind of flown under the radar a little bit is Keon Mosey, the running back out of Miami of Ohio, rostered on 2% of leagues right now. This past week, he was able, against Ball State, was able to go 22 rushing attempts for 105 yards. No touchdowns, unfortunately, which is kind of a theme with Mosey here. But with all that being said, right, like when you take a look at the fact that he has scored, 100 plus rushing yards in 5 of his last 6 games, you kind of wonder why he's still only rostered on 2% of leagues. And it's pretty much the thing I just alluded to, right? Is like when you look at that same stretch of games, those 6 games, right? And he's only scored a pair of touchdowns in that range of games. Suddenly you can kind of see how he can go unnoticed in CFF leagues. Like, don't get me wrong, like lack of scoring touchdowns, very big no-no for CFF, right? But 2 things. I do have 2 rebuttals on that. Firstly, touchdown regression is extremely real in CFF, right? And Mosey, given, just how many rushing yards he's putting up right now, compared to the number of touchdowns he's got, he's a prime candidate for some bounce back here in the next couple of weeks. And then secondly, if you're an offense that's struggling in any way, shape, or form, or you're missing something from an offensive performance, going up against Kent State's defense is about as good of a medicine as you could possibly ask for. Like, given how bad Kent State's defense is, if Mosey can't score touchdowns here in this game, quite frankly, at that point, there's just something wrong with him, right? On top of having the Kent State matchup this week, Mosey faces Northern Illinois and Bowling Green to finish the season. On paper, Northern Illinois is kind of a tough matchup, but given the fact that we just saw Jaden Nixon basically give the Huskies issues all last week, we do know that NIU can be beaten in the run game now. Is Miami of Ohio going to be able to be the team that's able to do that? I don't really know. But even still, you take out Northern Illinois. After that, you get the Red Hawks going up against Bowling Green. They're 93rd in the country facing the run. So, obviously a great matchup against Kent State, a questionable matchup versus NIU, and a solid matchup against Bowling Green there to finish the season. Again, there's not many true volume peg running backs that you can get at this point in the season. And so when you get a guy like Mosey that is just consistently getting a certain number of carries, consistently getting that 100 plus yards production, I don't think you could really go wrong with him over the next couple of weeks. Last running back that I wish to discuss here, boy, oh boy, this is going to be a fun one. If you're watching on YouTube, you already see the name. But if you're on podcast, let me just lead with this. I'm going to let you guys know something. We're about to discuss this running back. And this running back is going to do one of 2 things for you if you pick him up off the waiver wire. This man is either going to be the reason you fly through the playoffs and win your championships, or he will be the reason why you knock yourself out early in the first round, right? There is going to be no in between with Dylan Carson, the running back and potential super back out of Air Force, right? Yeah, I can already hear some of you guys either moaning or some of y'all like questioning, like, yes, that same Dylan Carson from way back in the preseason when I was hyping him up as, a steal in all formats, especially with him having 3 years eligibility. I was so ready for Carson to be the new super back of Air Force. And quite frankly, he's just kind of blown chunks this year, right? Like, it's not just him, though. Like, again, the whole Air Force squad has just been flat out terrible because apparently it's illegal for all 3 service academies to be good at the exact same time. But regardless, Carson's just been abysmal this year, even when he does kind of get some run. Despite being clearly one of the best backs returning from last year's squad, like he's only crossed the 50-yard threshold once to this point in the season. But then something really particular happened this past week when Air Force surprisingly upset Fresno State. This past weekend, for the first time this season, in my opinion, we really saw the Air Force that looked like what we expected it to look like, right? We saw a ton of yards on the ground, very limited passing, and an effective rushing attack that really slowed the game down, right? Carson led this rushing attack with a whopping 33 carries and finished with 120 yards. Obviously, the efficiency sucks there, like he's less than 4 yards per carry, but if this volume holds, Carson might be the grab of the week. Like I said, he could be a league winner, potentially. I don't need to remind veteran CFF players what that Air Force superback role has been able to accomplish in the past. And if you don't know what I speak, go check out what a healthy Emmanuel Michel looked like last season. And if you look at the years before that, look at Brad Roberts' monster seasons, right? If what we saw this past week against Fresno State is Air Force kind of finally figuring things out, and they're going forward with this strategy, which they absolutely should because it worked against a really solid Fresno State team. If they go forward with this, Carson will be a must-own these next 3 weeks, right? And it's not just the volume. The volume's great. Don't get me wrong. The volume's great against anybody, but even better, this schedule. Holy crap. If you can grab a running back that can get 30-plus carries against this upcoming schedule, this is a potential, like I said, potential monster finish of the season in the making here for Dylan Carson, right? The Falcons are going to take on 3 teams here. They're going to take on Oregon State, Nevada, and San Diego State. All 3 of those matchups involve teams whose defensive rushing performance is inside the country's bottom 30. In the case of Oregon State, you're talking bottom 2, right? I don't think you can ask for a better string of games. Again, Oregon State, 133rd against the run. Nevada, 123rd against the run. San Diego State, 107th versus the run. And honestly, they might go down even further this week because of what they gave up to New Mexico this past week, right? Just an absolute dream schedule. But all of this assumes that Air Force's coaching staff doesn't pull something dumb and rethink their entire game plan from what worked last week, right? Unfortunately, I don't really trust them not to do that. So I'm being very clear here. Dylan Carson is a high-risk, high-reward player for this week, right? You pick him up, there's a possibility that you're getting a guy with 30 carries going up against one of the softest rushing defensive stretches you've ever seen a workhorse back go against. Or you grab him, he comes out next week against Oregon State, has 4 carries for 15 yards, and you potentially are knocked out of the playoffs. But you could also have 33 carries for 200-plus yards and 2 touchdowns. I don't think there's going to be an in-between. I really think that this is if you are a gambler, which, again, given the fact, the kind of sports we play, right? But if you're somebody who, maybe you snuck into the playoffs, maybe you're kind of sitting there thinking like, oh, well, I'm probably going to get knocked out this week anyway unless I do something drastic. Carson's the dude to roll out there, right? Yeah, if you roll him out there and you get, 15 yards out of him and that sucks, but, you're kind of sitting there thinking like, okay, I was going to get knocked out anyway. Or you could throw him out there and he could potentially flip that entire matchup on its head. If you can't tell, I'm kind of excited about this. I'm fingers crossed because I liked Carson since the very beginning. I really hope this is a really nice stretch for him at the end of the year. But again, high risk, high reward player. Let's talk about some honorable mentions at running back. Again, a lot of great options here. Eli Sanders, still rostered at only 20% of leagues. He is going up against Washington State. It's a great matchup for the run, and he's just been on a heater the past 2 weeks that would make BoJack Horseman jealous, right? 16 carries, 173 yards, and 2 touchdowns versus San Diego State this past week. 17 carries, 205 yards, and 2 touchdowns versus Wyoming. He's been on a tear. Get a nice matchup against Washington State here. Gerald Green out of Troy, him and honestly Damian Taylor, like tons of volume between those two last couple of weeks. I don't know if this is a permanent change by the staff, but they clearly want to rely on their two top backs here. They get Georgia Southern this week. I already talked about them earlier. That is a fantastic matchup for any kind of rushing attack. Green's been great over the last couple of weeks, 19 and 20 carries in his last two matchups, over 100 yards and a touchdown in each of them. I think there's a chance that he goes off again against Southern. Aljae Henderson, I talked about him last week. Again, very consistent volume over the last couple of weeks, very consistent production. They get a fantastic matchup against Ball State, so I'd heavily consider him. George Pettaway goes up against Old Dominion. Old Dominion's rushing defense is absolutely tough there. Pettaway has been very nice production-wise. Again, 119 yards for Southern Miss, 95 yards versus Georgia Southern. Like I mentioned, Old Dominion is another great matchup. He should be able to put up another great performance there. And then Amari Daniels. Again, this is a bit of a risky play, but you get New Mexico State as your opponent this week. If you're Amari Daniels, that running back room for Texas A&M is getting uber thin. And so, Daniels is probably going to be the clear number one back for Texas A&M this upcoming weekend. You get a nice cushy matchup there against New Mexico State. I think he's in for a really, really solid performance this week. So, those are my honorable mentions. That being said, another sip of water, and we can get to the wide receivers. All right. I'll be fully honest with you guys. I think wide receiver might be my least favorite position to be targeted on the waiver wire right now, unless it's a PPR league. Because between the three guys that we have today, all three are solid PPR options, not so great in standard. Because the production's a little inconsistent. The touchdowns aren't very consistent at all for any of these three guys. But if you get a PPR format in there, very much could quickly add up with how much these are getting. So we'll start with Demir Miller here, the wide receiver out of Rutgers, rostered on 3% of leagues. This past week, 13 targets, 5 receptions for 58 yards, and 2 touchdowns. The week before was really the mouth-watering one, where against USC, 11 catches, 131 yards, no touchdowns. But this is one of those cases where you gotta trust a Rutgers wide receiver. I bet a bunch of you are sitting there thinking, why would I ever trust a Rutgers wide receiver? To which I say, fair question, but I will tell you why, right? One, Miller's not quite the typical talent that comes through Rutgers. Rutgers has always kind of struggled to grab great wide receiver talent, but Miller kind of comes to Rutgers through the transfer portal. Transferred up from Monmouth University here. He caught 90 balls for almost 1,300 yards and 9 touchdowns last year. The staff was clearly excited to get this addition, and while it's kind of taken a while for this Rutgers passing game to kind of get going, and I'll be honest, arguably, I don't think you could ever really say that it'll get going as long as Ethan Kaliak-Manis is under center, but regardless, in recent weeks, Miller has become the clear top target for the Spartans, and really at times he's the only dang target, right? He's hit 33 targets over his past 2 weeks, including that monster 20 target game against USC. Now you might be sitting there thinking I'm thinking the same thing where I wouldn't expect a 20 target game the rest of the season. I would agree. And you might be saying to yourself well, this doesn't seem very like this is very typical of Rutgers or anything like that. To which I say, yeah, if you look at Rutgers history, sure. But this is not unheard of for Kirk Soraka, the offensive coordinator at Rutgers, right? During Soraka's time at Minnesota, Soraka oversaw both of Tyler Johnson's monster seasons where he had 126 and 119 targets each season, respectively. While I don't think Miller can kind of get those production levels so long as, Kaliak-Manis is throwing the ball, the volume really is too much to ignore here over the last couple of weeks, like I said, especially in PPR formats. While I'd love to see Miller kind of turn more of these targets into receptions, like I said, I don't think you could really, there's only so much you can do when the guy throwing you the ball would probably struggle at the FCS level, right? So Miller, I think, has some decent upcoming matchups. Again, both Maryland and Michigan State, weeks 12 and 14 respectively there, are ranked outside the top 99 in defensive team performance against the pass. Illinois is a bit stingier at 69th, but still weak enough that a talent like Miller could still have a nice day. So regardless, Miller, fantastic PPR option over the next couple of weeks. I like what he can bring. Another wide receiver, in a very similar vein, is Justin Lockhart, the wide receiver out of San Jose State, rostered on 12% of rosters here. Man, oh man, Lockhart's been kind of fun, right? After missing last year, right, many of us kind of hoped for like a huge bounce back season from Lockhart. Instead, it's clearly been Nick Nash stealing the show, right? He's wide receiver 1 in all of CFF. We all know how that's going. But as the season has progressed, the Spartans have really needed a secondary option to emerge in this passing game to kind of take the heat off of Nash. And Lockhart has answered that call and has become a very steady league option in the last couple of weeks, especially PPR formats, right? The target numbers haven't really been consistent for Lockhart. Again, his target numbers over the last 3 games have been 7, 13, and 6. But what has been consistent is his usage and his efficiency. Lockhart has averaged over 23 yards a catch for 3 weeks straight. It is clear that the Spartans view Lockhart as their downfield threat, and there's no reason to think that he won't continue as that. As I kind of mentioned before, his production has been great, ranging from about 93 to 130 yards in each of his last 3 games. His problem really, like I said, has been touchdowns, right? For some reason, he's getting these long balls, but man, he's just not converting them into touchdowns for whatever reason. So regardless, hopefully touchdown regression is kind of coming Lockhart's way, especially with the way that they're using him. He could absolutely break some long ones here, especially in some of these juicier matchups, right? San Jose State faces Boise State and Sanford in weeks 12 and 14 respectively. Those 2 teams are ranked 87th and 120th in defensive team performance against the pass. I'd be very comfortable starting Lockhart as a flex option in either of those matchups. His matchup against UNLV kind of gives me some pause, but I think if you're really struggling for whatever reason, you can't find some good matchups, maybe I'd be okay with starting Lockhart in that case, especially in a PPR format. But regardless, I like how Lockhart's been here. He has, again, no touchdowns, but all 3 games coming 90-plus yards. It's a very good basis. He's really got everything you need for a PPR wide receiver. The touchdowns are just bonuses at this point. Last wide receiver that we will discuss here is Mr. Chris Carpenter, the wide receiver out of UTSA. Carpenter's kind of quietly become the leading target for UTSA, right? Which is a great thing given the historic nature of that role. Plus, UTSA's second half of the season offensive resurgence here is obviously something that we want to get involved here with. Obviously, Devin McEwen's been injured. He's kind of been back and forth in the season. Meanwhile, Carpenter's been very, very consistent, or not very consistent production-wise, but he's clearly been a steady force for UTSA. In the past 4 games, Carpenter has seen 8+ targets in each of them, which is translated to really increasing production from him each week. In his games against Tulsa and Memphis, Carpenter hit the 100-yard mark in yardage for both games. He even managed to score a touchdown in one of those games, but unfortunately, like I said, touchdowns have been a problem. That touchdown he scored was the only one over his last 4 games, despite having 37 targets in that same stretch. But why am I excited? Why am I recommending him? Well, I kind of touched on it earlier. UTSA, North Texas, is a prime opportunity for Carpenter to have his biggest game of the season, right? UTSA, they're taking on North Texas in a game that I assume, like I said, will have totals in the 70s. It might be the shootout of the weekend. I really should stop saying that because every time I do, those games end with less than 40 points. But regardless, right, this is expected to be a high-scoring game. Carpenter will be very heavily involved in this game, especially if Devin McEwen is out or limited again, right? Carpenter's a leading target on this team. He will have plenty of opportunities to score in this game. The fun doesn't even stop there, though, as UTSA will face Temple the next week after their 105th in defensive team performance. And then in the final week of the season, UTSA will face Army, which is obviously never really a fun matchup for CFF players, but really by that point, you'll have all your players back off buys and stuff like that. Plus, we saw that, obviously, Army destroyed North Texas this past week, but East Carolina showed that Army can be susceptible against the secondary as well. So we will see which kind of matchup we get whenever UTSA and Army face each other in Week 14. But for right now, let's take a look at these honorable mentions at wide receiver. A couple of really good options out there. True Edwards, the wide receiver out of Louisiana Tech, has been on a really nice run over the last couple weeks. A great PPR option. 12 targets, 7 targets, 13 targets, 8 targets over his last 4 games. 2 games with 2 touchdowns in them each. Maybe we spread those out just a little bit more, but 200-yard games, 3 80-plus yard games in the last 4 games here, right? Very consistent option. In a full PPR format, you're looking at, 9 receptions, 6 receptions, 8 receptions, 6 receptions. So that's just an incredible base floor for Edwards to have going in, week out for your teams. Everything else really just kind of becomes very much bonus at that point. So another name to throw out here, Jordan Napier. I believe I talked about him last week's show. He's going against UNLV, which I obviously don't love, but considering the fact that he's got 27 targets over his last 2 games here, clearly Danny O'Neill's favorite target currently, I think it's hard to pass him up. I'd obviously love some more touchdown opportunities for Napier. I'd love for this offense to kind of kick into a higher gear, score a few more points. Again, they haven't scored more than 26 points in each of their last 3 games. You like to see, obviously, that improve just a little bit. Maybe a few less touchdowns to Marquez Cooper during this playoff stretch. Get Napier the ball just a little bit more. Another name to throw out here, Cameron Shanks, wide receiver to UAB. Had himself a bit of a down week this past week. He had 5 catches, 50 yards, 2 rushing attempts for 30 yards. So 80 yards on the day, so not terrible, but no touchdowns. But he still had, 10-plus targets, right? He's going up against Memphis this week. That's a game that UAB is going to have to pass the ball in order to keep up in. They're going to have to score in that game, so I think Shanks could be in for another good week there. Matt Sykes, he's on bye this week, but comes back the week after. He has been very consistent. And then last but not least, I'm just kind of throwing this name out there. Again, I know. I said I would stop trying to chase Miami of Ohio wide receivers here. But Javon Tracy, wide receiver of Miami of Ohio, rostered on 5% of leagues. He's been very solid for Miami of Ohio the last couple of weeks. Again, a touchdown each of his last 3 games. Against Central Michigan, 118 yards. Against Ball State, 85 yards there. If he can just kind of keep this going this next week against Kent State, which, again, Miami of Ohio should be able to basically name the score against Kent State there, I think Tracy will be in for a solid day, maybe even multiple touchdowns. So lastly, we'll hit up on tight ends here. I'll have one official tight end recommendation, but I do have some honorable mentions that I'm not going to show on the screen, but I will throw it out there to you guys who are listening and reward you guys who are actually watching and listening to the show and not just skipping through all the graphics if you're on the YouTube side of things. That's right, guys. I can see where you skip to. At tight end, Joshua Simon, tight end out of South Carolina here, rostered on 16% of leagues. He had 3 catches, 40 yards, and a touchdown this past week. He's been very solid for the Gamecocks. Ever since the Gamecocks have really come out of this bye, they are looking a lot better on offense, and Simon's been a huge part of this offensive resurgence. It really even started before the bye week against Oklahoma. Simon, 4 catches, 43 yards, and a touchdown there. Against Texas A&M, he went bonkers. 4 catches, 132 yards, and 2 touchdowns in that game. And then this past week against Vandy, again, another respectable line. Again, I already mentioned it, 3 catches, 40 yards, and a touchdown. Very, very consistent work here. He gets Missouri this week. Don't love that matchup. I think it'll be a relatively low-scoring game, but as we already saw, he's still pretty involved. Pretty much any time you get down to the red zone with South Carolina. And so, even if his target numbers aren't fantastic compared to the likes of a guy like, Houston Thomas at UTSA, or even like a John Michael Gillenborg at Wyoming, finding a guy like Simon who is just a very clear part of the offensive game plan whenever his team gets down to the red zone is honestly worth its weight in gold if you're trying to find somebody this late in the season to kind of anchor your tight end position. Another guy that very much fits this mold is Cooper Mathers, the tight end out of Washington State, who has done literally nothing but score touchdowns. Yes, he's had 4 or less targets in every single game, but man, Mathers, he finds a way into the end zone some way, shape, or form. He'll probably do it again this week because Washington State plays New Mexico, who has probably one of the worst defenses in the country. So, and I kind of mentioned the other 2 guys I wanted to mention here, Houston Thomas and John Michael Gillenborg, 2 volume guys that you would probably like if you're out there. Again, Gillenborg, 137 yards and a touchdown versus San Jose State about 3 weeks ago was obviously very nice. And the Houston Thomas, week before, 132 yards was obviously great. And then this past week, 6 catches, 44 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Some pretty solid tight end options this late in the season, but I imagine if you're in the playoffs, you probably got tight end already pretty figured out. So, last but not least, let's touch on these DST streaming options for Week 11, and I'm letting you all know. Just think, for everybody who makes fun of the SEC for some of these late season cupcake matchups, they are gold for CFF here, right? And the 3 that really come to mind: Auburn going against UM Monroe. Auburn's defense, for all of Auburn's faults, Auburn's defense has been very solid this year. So I think they'll be able to pretty easily shut down a UM Monroe team. At least they better. Texas A&M's going up against New Mexico State. I like Texas A&M's defense quite a bit. They're going to outclass New Mexico State here. I think they should be able to get a very solid performance here. And then Kentucky, they got Mercer coming to town. Mercer's always struggled against SEC competition. So Kentucky should be able to shut them down pretty easy. Another team in the SEC where defense is probably Kentucky's strength. They'll be able to shut down Mercer pretty solidly. I mean, they had a shutout against another FCS opponent earlier this year. So the 2 that are a bit more down there, but I think are pretty solid plays. What is Sam Houston? They're going up against Kennesaw State. I already kind of mentioned Kennesaw State earlier this show. Their offense looks better, but they did also just fire their head coach. This is a team that obviously one knows they're out of it for pretty much any bowl game or anything like that. Without their head coach, I really think they just have nothing left to fight for. Sam Houston is a team that has been able to really shut down teams recently. Let me see if I can pull up their stats here, because I want to make sure I'm being truthful here with the scoring that they're allowing. Yeah, over the last couple of weeks against Florida International, they held FIU to 7 points. They held Louisiana Tech to 3 points. They, again, unless you're a team like, West Kentucky, you're not really putting a ton of points up on Sam Houston here recently. Kennesaw State's not that. Sam Houston should be able to shut them down pretty easily. And then last but not least, I've kind of mentioned this matchup a couple of times already, but Miami of Ohio is facing Kent State. Kent State's a team that is straight up quit this year. They're not trying at all. It sucks for us who own, Christian McCrae's and, the Luke Florias, because they looked really solid for a decent chunk of the season before this entire staff, this entire team has just decided to mail in the rest of the season. They don't give a crap anymore. They know they're done. There's nothing to fight for left, so they're just kind of going through the motions at this point. Good. We'll take advantage of that. We'll have Miami of Ohio, a solid MAC defense already, going up against probably one of the worst offenses in the country right now, a team that is just straight up quit. So, all that being said, we are at the end of the show, and I did run through that show pretty quickly, but again, like I said, there wasn't really a ton to talk about, right? A lot of you guys, if you're getting ready for playoffs, you are pretty set in your teams already. Obviously, we got to get through some bye weeks here in Week 12, Week 13, a couple more bye weeks, and really it's just a matter of trying to watch out for some bad matchups over the next couple of weeks. But for now, yeah, appreciate all of you guys listening. If you guys have not already, just a quick reminder, leave a like, comment, and subscribe. If you're watching this on the YouTube side of things, if you're on the podcast side of things, make sure you follow the show. Leave a 5-star review wherever you can. Make sure you check out the rest of the Campus to Canton podcast network for shows ranging on pretty much anything you can think of related to the college fantasy game. We'll see you guys back here on Wednesday. Justin will be rejoining us for another round of start sits for this upcoming week. Until then, I really appreciate you guys, and I hope you guys have a wonderful and blessed week. See y'all.